Hi, I'm Robin, and today we're going to learn how to authenticate Terraform providers with Vault-backed dynamic credentials. So first, what are dynamic credentials? Well, if you've used Terraform much at all, you've needed to authenticate with your cloud provider using credentials. And you use those credentials and Terraform takes them, authenticates with your cloud provider's API, and provisions your resources for you. Now, as you use Terraform more, and especially as you collaborate with the team, you're going to run into some friction using those credentials. You need to make sure that the credentials are in the right place at the right time, whether that's on my laptop here or in Terraform Cloud in the right workspace. And you might need to rotate those credentials occasionally, or even just figure out, okay, which project is using which credentials and what permissions do those credentials give them. And to add to that, you also need to keep those credentials secure the whole time, because of course, exposing your cloud credentials can lead to some attacker getting access to them and doing nefarious things with your cloud infrastructure. Dynamic credentials solve those problems in a few different ways. What they do is they allow you to provision resources without using that pre-configured set of static credentials. The way that works is you configure your dynamic credentials for your Terraform Cloud workspace or project. And when you provision resources, Terraform Cloud first, instead of sending those static credentials, sends a workload identity to your cloud provider. Your cloud provider then responds by checking to make sure that your Terraform Cloud account has permission to use dynamic credentials in the given workspace or project. There's two flavors of dynamic credentials. You can either use dynamic credentials directly with your cloud provider, or you can use Vault to back those dynamic credentials and Vault Secrets Engine to authenticate with the cloud provider. And we'll be looking at both of those scenarios in this workshop. All of this is based on an open source protocol called OpenID Connect, or OIDC. So that means you can use dynamic provider credentials, not just with the major cloud providers, but with any cloud provider that supports OIDC. And let's look at a little diagram of a simple dynamic credentials setup. Terraform Cloud makes that OIDC connection to your cloud provider. That cloud provider responds with temporary credentials, and then Terraform Cloud uses those credentials for the given session, whether it's a plan or apply or whatever. And then once you're done provisioning those resources, those temporary credentials expire, and so they can't be reused, even if somehow somebody got access to them to try to attack your infrastructure. So, talking about the why, first, it can help you reduce your operational complexity. So you don't need to rotate your credentials. You just set up the dynamic credential trust relationship once for a given project or workspace, and then everything just works behind the scenes with a new set of credentials being created for every operation. I already mentioned this lowers the risk of reuse if your credentials are exposed, and also means you don't have to share those static credentials with one or two or three people on your team or within your organization. And then finally, it allows us to scope the access that each workspace or project gets, so that we can follow a least privilege approach, and that way each project only has access to the cloud resources that you're going to configure. Again, I mentioned there's two types. You can configure this OIDC relationship directly with your cloud provider, or if you're using Vault, you'll probably want Vault to back those that OIDC relationship. And in this scenario, you enable that trust relationship between Vault and TFC instead of your cloud provider and TFC, and then you use Vault Secrets Engine to actually provision the credentials that you'll use to manage your resources. And here's a diagram of that. Essentially, Vault is in the middle, and it's the one providing the credentials to Terraform Cloud and managing ultimately the credentials for your cloud provider. Okay. So what are the advantages of Vault-backed dynamic credentials? We already saw it at least adds a little bit of complexity because you're using Vault there. But the advantages that you get are you only have to configure that OIDC connection once in Vault. If you're using multiple cloud providers, that may be a lot easier than using different OIDC connections for each one, and each cloud provider has a little bit of different semantics and challenges around how they support OIDC. It also allows you to consolidate your secrets management in Vault. If you're using Vault, you're already probably doing that, and this allows you to keep doing that or do it more when you're using dynamic credentials. And then Vault, instead of having a timeout as kind of the normal OIDC flow goes, Vault will explicitly revoke those credentials as soon as the run phase is complete. Again, reducing that exposure window of potentially having compromised credentials. And then finally, if you're using Terraform Enterprise, one of the ways that OIDC works is your cloud provider needs to make an inbound connection to Terraform Cloud or Terraform Enterprise. And your organization may have strict firewall rules around what can connect to Terraform Enterprise. Using Vault, that connection can happen within your private network. Assuming Vault and Terraform Enterprise are on the same network, the connection happens within your network rather than getting a connection from outside. And here's a little diagram of the sequence of events here. When you provision infrastructure using dynamic credentials, first Terraform Cloud injects something called a workload identity token into the Terraform Cloud agent, and that includes information about your organization and the project and workspace that are actually attempting to provision your resources. Then it provides that identity token to either your cloud provider, if you're using that scenario, or to Vault, which responds with the credentials after it verifies that the request is correct. It checks your Terraform Cloud or Terraform Enterprise public key, and also checks to make sure that the workspace that's requesting changes or project matches the trust relationship that you configured. And then finally, Terraform Cloud can use those temporary credentials to plan or apply. And then once that's complete, they either expire after TTL or Vault expires them for you as soon as the operation is complete. And then the next time you plan or apply on that workspace, the same process happens and you get a new set of temporary credentials. So what's the workflow for how do you set this up? First, you've got to create that trust relationship with your cloud provider, and we'll be looking at a few different ways to do that in this workshop. And then you configure your workspace or a project to use that trust relationship. And then once that's set up, you provision infrastructure just as you normally would with Terraform Cloud. From the end user's perspective, the credentials are set up or the trust relationship is set up. They don't need that secret key or secret key ID or whatever your cloud credentials are configured and saved in the workspace. That's already taken care of for them by that trust relationship. And then again, the Vault-backed scenario adds another piece. First, you enable Vault Secrets Engine for your cloud provider. If you're using Vault, you may have that already set up, or you may be setting this up for the first time and configure that secrets engine. And then from there, you create the trust relationship between Terraform Cloud and Vault instead of between Terraform Cloud and your cloud provider. And then you configure your workspace or project to use a trust relationship and provision infrastructure just as you would without Vault. So this workshop is going to look at two different stakeholder functions. First, we're going to think about maybe a security function that might be a different team, depending on your organization, or it might be the initial setup that you do when you're saying, hey, we're going to start a new project and it's going to be able to provision this kind of resources. And here's the, say, IAM role that it's going to use and the IAM permissions. And that allows you to use all the flexibility and power of IAM to, again, reduce the scope of what this project can manage. Once that's set up, the operator can go and develop Terraform configuration, deploy resources, manage them, again, without having to manage your credentials as well. So in this scenario, we're going to look at a few different ways to set up trust relationships. First, to keep things simple, we're going to just create a single trust relationship, use it to provision infrastructure, and talk about how that works, what the different pieces are. Now, you'll find that maybe you don't want to have to do it one-off every time. Often you'll want some sort of automation, maybe the ability to audit what your trust relationships are. So in the second step, we're going to provision a project in Terraform Cloud that you can use to manage all of your trust relationships. That way, everything's in one place. And again, if it's a separate team or even the same team that's setting up the security settings, all of that's in one place, and you can manage and audit it separately from provisioning your actual infrastructure. And then we're going to use that project to create a vault-backed trust relationship. And finally, we'll look at how you might use that to allow the provisioning of no-code modules. So no-code modules will allow us to provision infrastructure without writing Terraform configuration. So next, we're going to look at the demo. This is based on a few different tutorials, and depending on whether you're using Vault in this scenario, you might want to use the first tutorial or the second tutorial if you are using Vault, which goes through the Vault-backed scenario versus just connecting to your cloud provider. And just a moment while I switch desktops, we are going to look at some configuration. All right, found the right one. No, I didn't. There we go. Now we found the right one. So we'll apply this configuration in a moment, but before I do, let's just look at the different pieces. Of course, you've got your AWS provider, but then to establish the trust relationship, we need a few different things. And again, this is using AWS. Dynamic credentials work with all of the major cloud providers. So if you're looking for an example with, say, Google Cloud Platform or Azure, check out those tutorials that I linked to earlier for examples of those. But the process is pretty similar through whichever of the cloud providers you're using. So first, we're going to fetch Terraform Cloud's TLS certificate, or in the case of using Terraform Enterprise, same thing. We'll have our Terraform project get that TLS certificate and be able to verify that the connection is actually coming from Terraform Cloud. Next, we'll set up an OpenID Connect provider in AWS. It's going to use that TLS certificate to verify that. There's also this value called an audience, which is basically just a unique value for each cloud provider, which is how Terraform Cloud verifies that it's talking to the right cloud provider. And next, we need a role for the trust relationship to use. This is a pretty standard IAM role. It's going to allow a federated connection to that OpenID Connect provider that's going to allow whatever the request is coming in to assume that role. And it's going to verify that the host name is actually the right one from Terraform Cloud or Terraform Enterprise. And then it's going to check to make sure that the request is coming from your organization. And depending on whether you want to configure it for a given project or just a single workspace, it will check those as well. And then finally, run phase is just a plan or apply. And in this case, we're using a wildcard to say the same connection is for both plan and apply. And then that role is going to make use of a policy. So we've got our inbound connection for the trust relationship, asking for some dynamic credentials. Those dynamic credentials are going to be attached to a policy. In this case, we're keeping it pretty simple and just say, hey, these dynamic credentials can do anything we want to any EC2 resource. Again, IAM can be configured to be as fine-grained as you want. So you might have a more complex, more permissive, more restrictive IAM policy, depending on what the project that you're provisioning is going to need. And then we just attach that policy to the role. And then the rest of this configuration is pretty straightforward. We tell Terraform to use the correct provider. We have some variables that we can configure, such as the host name. If you're using your Terraform Enterprise instance, you need to tell it what organization name. Here, we're just going to use the default project, and then the exact name of the workspace that you're going to connect. And for the region, IAM is global, so it doesn't really matter too much what region you set, but we do need to set one so Terraform knows where to connect, which AWS endpoint to connect to. And then finally, in this configuration, we've got a couple of outputs just to verify that we know what the OpenID configuration is for your trust relationship and the ARN of that role that we're going to use for the relationship. That's going to be important later on when we configure our Terraform Cloud workspace to use the trust relationship. And we'll look at how that works in a few minutes. So that's our configuration. We're going to look at our terminal window, and I'm just going to run Terraform init to make sure everything's installed. And let's apply that configuration. Okay, so the configuration is ready to apply. It's looking at all those resources we just looked at. There's the policy and the connection, et cetera, et cetera. Let's apply that, and it should just take a few moments. And the apply is complete. And here's that role I mentioned earlier. We're going to need that. And also here's what the OpenID claims look like. In the OpenID protocol, a claim is just part of that workload identity token that that Terraform Cloud is presenting to your cloud provider. Terraform Cloud says, essentially, hello, here I am. Here's my TLS certificate, so you can verify that I am who I say I am. And I'm making a request on behalf of your organization. I'm using one for us. And here's the project. Again, for this example, we're using the default project. And finally, here's the name of the workspace. So for instance, if you tried to use this role with a different workspace or different project, then your cloud provider would reject the request. And of course, if you try to use it from a different. So once we're on the create new workspace page, we're going to create our workspace. We're going to use version control workflow. And I'm going to select my GitHub repository here. Here's the one. And again, this workspace name needs to match the OpenID claim. So let's look at that. We've got, this is the only workspace that's going to have access to this particular set of dynamic credentials. So I'm going to copy and paste that here. And it is in the default project, again, matching our OpenID claim. And Then for this example, we have some configuration in that directory. And we're going to create the workspace. And once the workspace is created, we're going to configure a couple of variables. I'm just going to go to the workspace overview and configure those variables. Now, if we were provisioning infrastructure without dynamic credentials, here is where we would add our secret key ID and secret key and all of that. And if you use Terraform Cloud at all, you've definitely done this part. But this is where, in order to manage those, you need to get those secret key ID and secret key from wherever they are. Maybe you create them in AWS through the console, or maybe you have some automation around that. But regardless, we're going to paste that secret value in here. And anytime you're moving secrets from one place to another, especially if you're doing it manually, there's the potential to expose those. So if I were showing off just Terraform Cloud and pasted my secret key in here, and it's a bunch of random letters, that could be exposed to anybody watching the Zoom or watching the recording. And of course, that's a security risk. So instead of using a secret, we're going to just set two environment variables here and that aren't secret. First, we just set one that tells Terraform Cloud that we are using dynamic credentials for the AWS provider, and add that one. And then the other variable that we need to set is we need to tell Terraform Cloud which role that we're requesting from AWS. And that is right here. So I'm going to copy and paste that. And the name of the variable, I'm also going to copy and paste to avoid any typos. If I can get my mouse to behave. Okay, and this is just an IAM role. It's not really all that sensitive. Even if somebody had access to that, they can't request dynamic credentials except from Terraform Cloud within your organization for the default project and for a workspace named exactly that. And I'm going to add that. And here's our workspace, and we're going to start a run. And while that's going on, let's just look at the infrastructure that we're going to provision. It's pretty simple for this example. We're just going to provision a single EC2 instance. Of course, your infrastructure is going to be more complex for a real world project. But again, that's going to make use of the IAM role that we configured. So whatever guardrails you want to put on this particular project, you would do that once for the trust relationship in IAM. So it looks like our run is planned. We're going to create a single EC2 instance. There it is. And we can apply that. So confirm and apply. And apply. And once that's run, we'll have our EC2 instance, again, with no need to configure static credentials for this workspace. Anytime we do any sort of action, we go through that process of Terraform Cloud, authenticating with your cloud provider by providing that workload identity token instead of static secrets. Your cloud provider is responding with dynamic credentials, which Terraform Cloud uses just for this particular apply of our plan. And that should just take a few seconds before it's created. And there we go. So now we have an EC2 instance that we can use for our project. And again, of course, in the real world, our configuration is going to be a bit more complex. So before I move on to the rest of the workshop, I'm just going to clean things up a little bit by destroying the EC2 instance I just created. And of course, this destroy action is again going to use dynamic credentials just as the original plan and apply did. So that will just take a moment. While that's running, I just want to talk about some of the advantages here. Again, we're not sharing static credentials. We're reducing our risk of exposing those credentials as we configure workspaces, and we can also separate that credentials management from between one team that's managing kind of our security posture and maybe another team that's actually provisioning the workspaces. So you have fewer people who have access to those credentials, again, reducing the risk of exposure. Just going to delete that. And then the other thing we want to talk about here is we still need to set up that trust relationship. You notice that I created the trust relationship from the command line. That is using a static set of credentials because we'd have to bootstrap the trust relationship. We need a way to configure them, which needs credentials. So if you're using this, using dynamic credentials and doing it each time for each project, that might become a little bit of a maintenance burden, and you might not get all of the advantages of dynamic credentials that you might want. So instead, for the next part of this workshop, we're going to create a project that's going to manage all of our trust relationships. So I've cleaned up that EC2 instance, and I'm just going to remove the workspace as well. And that just takes a moment. And then finally, just to clean everything out, let's remove that trust relationship. Before I do so, I want to make one more note, caveat that you'll want to be aware of. Since we're matching the workspace name and project name, if you change the workspace name, then that will break the trust relationship. So that's something to be aware of as far as managing your workspaces and projects, is the trust relationship is based on the name of both of those things. Okay, so we've destroyed that. And to move on, let's look at a different set of let me actually do it this way. And so this directory, or Git repository, I should say, has a few different directories, and we're going to use that to configure the trust project, and then we'll configure some trust relationships within that. So let's look at what this trust project contains. So we've got some configuration right here. And starting in this file, TFE, which we're going to use to configure, in this case, Terraform Cloud, but the same configuration works for Terraform Enterprise. What I'm going to do is create a project, and inside that project is we're going to manage all of our trust relationships. And that project is going to contain everything we need to create the trust relationships. Again, imagining we have two different roles here. The security team is going to manage this trust project and then hand out trust relationships to one or more application teams. Again, depending on your organization, maybe that's the same team, maybe it's different teams. Regardless, we're scoping down where our credentials are and who has access to what resources. So first, we're going to create the project itself within Terraform Cloud. We're also going to create a team that has access to create the projects and workspaces that we're going to provision resources in. We need a token for that team because we're going to make API requests on behalf of our team. And then we're going to set up a variable set. And that variable set is going to have all of the information we need to create the trust relationships. we attach the variable set to our trust project. And then there's several variables here to specify your organization name, that token we mentioned earlier. This is going to use Vault. So we're going to set our Vault credentials and the URL for our Vault instance. And then we'll look at the policy and some of the other configuration in the other files. But long story short, we're passing these variables to our to Terraform Cloud so that it can manage our trust relationships. I'm going to switch to the AWS configuration. And this configuration is going to be about setting up Vault Secrets Engine. Again, Vault is going to act in the middle and manage our credentials for us. And it's going to use the Secrets Engine, which if you're using Vault with your cloud provider, you're probably already using a Secrets Engine. For this workshop, we're going to set one up using a pretty standard configuration here. So that Secrets Engine is going to be configured in Vault. Start at the top of the file. And so first we set our provider, and then we're going to set up that secret backend. It's going to use AWS's access key and secret key. And then just like we did with AWS, we're going to set up that OIDC provider in Vault. Again, looking for, in this case, Terraform Cloud or your Terraform Enterprise instance. And then we need a policy to say what our trust relationships project can do within Vault. And that's right here. And then we're going to set up Vault authentication. So when we create the trust relationships, they can authenticate with Vault to set that up. And then the other things in this directory are really just our variables and outputs. We've got several different things that we can configure here. Again, for this workshop, keeping it fairly simple and just using Terraform Cloud rather than Terraform Enterprise. So getting to the right window here, I'm going to run Terraform init. And again, this is the bootstrapping process of creating dynamic credentials. So we're going to use static credentials, in this case, once to set everything up. And then we're not going to use static credentials anymore. So you do have to bootstrap this, but we're reducing the scope of where we're using static credentials and only using dynamic credentials after that. So that might take just a moment to create everything in Vault and AWS, as well as Terraform Cloud. And then we're going to give out some information about the trust project. So I'm just going to manage my windows here for just a moment. Okay, so now that the trust project is created, I need to reload the page here to see it in Terraform Cloud. And there we go. So here's the trust relationships project that we created a moment ago. And all of our trust relationships will be going in here. So let's look at two different kinds of trust relationships. First, we're going to create a trust relationship for a single workspace, as we did before, and then we'll create a trust relationship for an entire project. So I'll go to New and select Workspace. Again, we're using the version control workflow, and I'm going to select the correct Git repository, which is this one. And we're going to give our workspace a name, just to have a unique name. I'm going to call it Trust Project Vulkan. So again, imagining our scenario, I've got my hat of a security person on. We're launching a new project, and that project team needs to be able to provision resources. Project Vulkan. So I'm creating this trust relationship for Project Vulkan. It's going to be in that trust relationships project. And again, you might separate this out into multiple GitHub repositories when you're configuring this for your organization. But to keep things simple for the workshop, we put everything in one GitHub repository. So this is going to duplicate the trust relationship that we made earlier, just using Vault instead of connecting directly to AWS. So we don't need to set anything else there. And Terraform Cloud is going to load that configuration. And I'm just going to go to the workspace overview. Those variables there, they're already set for the whole trust project, so I don't need to set them here. The one thing I do need to configure, and before we do that, let's look at the variables. And just to go back a little bit to the configuration, the trust project created those variables right here. So we created a variable set attached to the project, and then configure the variables for every workspace within the trust project. So my workspace has access to everything it needs to create that trust project. The only thing I need to set here is we need to set the name of the workspace. And that's going to be this TFC workspace name. And again, I'm just copying and pasting from another desktop to avoid typos on the Zoom. So we're saying, hey, give this trust relationship to this workspace. I've added that. And let's create the workspace. And just to reiterate, we're doing this one-time setup for Project Vulkan as our security team. We'll need to set this up once when we set up the project. We'd also need to go in here and change it, say if the permissions that we're giving to Project Vulkan need to change. So we're setting it up so that they can create EC2 instances. Maybe the project requirements change, and we need to set up an RDS instance or Lambda function or whatever. To do that, we need to expand the scope of that IAM policy. And once I create that, it should just take a moment. And we'll look at what the IAM policy is here as part of the plan. It went a little quick, but we created both the policy, the role, we attached the role, many of the same things that we did on the first example, except this time we're using Vault to mediate that. Again, we're saying, here's the OpenID claim for our organization. In this case, in the default project, and the workspace name is kind of broken from one line to another, but that's going to be the workspace that's allowed to use this trust relationship. And again, it's just allowed to do stuff with EC2 instances, and then we've got the role and things like that. However, instead of creating the workspace manually like we did before, Terraform Cloud has created the workspace for us. So let's look at that. And going to start a run. And this is going to work pretty much identically to how it did in the previous example. Now that the trust relationship is set up, we don't need to worry about any credentials or anything like that. In fact, let's look at the variables for this. Let's look at the variables for this. There it is. And you'll see that we're setting up Vault. And we're saying we're going to assume the role, and here's the ARN of that role that we created in the previous step. And there's a couple of other variables for Vault to say your namespace and that we are using dynamic credentials and the role itself. But we're using Terraform Cloud to set up all of that for us. Okay, and it looks like we have planned that. So we're again just creating a simple EC2 instance, and we can confirm and apply that. So this is a little bit more more pieces than the first example, but now rather than having to set up each trust relationship manually, we can do so through Terraform Cloud. And I'll just give that instance a minute to come online. It should just take a moment. There we go. And we provisioned our instance. Again, we don't need to share static credentials at all here, and everything's scoped to exactly what our project needs. And again, just to keep things nice and clean, I'm going to remove the instance before we move on. And again, using the same dynamic credentials, this time instead of connecting directly to AWS, Terraform Cloud connects to Vault, presents that workload identity token. Vault verifies that the workspace project and organization are correct, and that the request is coming from Terraform Cloud. Once all that's done, it provisions these temporary credentials for us to destroy that instance. And then finally, let's just remove that workspace. We'll do that. To remove the, backing up just a moment. To remove the workspace, since it's managed through Terraform Cloud, let's say the project is over and we're ready to deprovision it. We can do so through Terraform Cloud with a destroy plan here. And that'll remove our workspace and clean up the trust relationship so we can configure more. We could, of course, leave that out there as well, just for the purposes of following the tutorial, though. I'm going to remove it. And that'll just take a moment. And we'll start that destroy plan. So we've used trust relationships to provision resources in a couple of different ways. Just to recap what we've gone through, I know this has been several different steps and we're moving kind of quickly. First, we created a single trust relationship and we use that provision infrastructure with AWS. And then now we're working on a trust project where we can configure multiple trust relationships using Vault to manage our credentials for us. The third scenario we're going to look at is how to use dynamic credentials with another Terraform Cloud feature called no-code modules. Now, depending on whether or not you've used no-code modules, you may or may not be familiar with them. So just to give a little bit of an overview, no-code modules allow us to set up a module in our Terraform Cloud or Terraform Enterprise registry. And that module can then be deployed by multiple times in different workspaces without each workspace needing to write and manage their Terraform configuration. And this is useful for if you are deploying sets of configuration that only need a little bit of configuration. And in this example, we're going to use that to say, hey, we're going to publish a module that allows us to manage S3 buckets. And we're going to say, hey, in our organization, you can create a public S3 bucket with whatever controls we want on that. But you don't have to write your configuration. You don't have to go and find some AWS credentials and manage them yourself. Dynamic credentials will just allow us to set it up once with whatever controls we have for our organization, and then allow people to self-serve and provision their resources without having to write Terraform configuration or having to manage their cloud credentials. So I'm going to publish a new module. Again, using our pre-set up GitHub configuration. I've got a module right here. We're going to say this is going to be used for no-code provisioning and publish the module. While that's publishing, let's look at the configuration for the module. Again, we're keeping the end configuration fairly simple. This is just going to provision an S3 bucket for public website hosting. We configure ACLs and things like that. If you've ever configured this with Terraform, you know there's a few different pieces that you have to configure and get right. And again, we're looking at a self-service scenario. We don't want everybody who needs a public S3 bucket to have to use the same configuration. So this way, we write the configuration once. It's now a module that we can reuse without dynamic credentials. However, we get a little bit of a problem where even if I'm publishing my S3 bucket with a no-code module, I still need my AWS credentials. So using dynamic credentials with no-code modules, we both save the effort of writing our configuration, but also of managing those security credentials, making it a lot easier for people who are maybe a little less familiar with AWS or Terraform and just want one pre-baked thing, in this case, an S3 bucket. So in order to actually start provisioning those RS3 buckets, we're going to create a project that is going to manage all of them. So to do that, I need to get to the right organization. I'm going to create a new workspace and version control workflow with GitHub. And once again, we're using the same GitHub repository in the real world for your organization. You might want to use different GitHub repositories for this, just keeping things a little bit simpler for the lab. So this new workspace needs to go into our trust relationships project. And we're going to call this project where we're allowing our end users to provision S3 buckets, Project Phoenix. And we're going to set the working directory. And again, I'm just copying and pasting this from off screen to avoid typos. So create the workspace. It's going to parse our configuration. While it's doing that, I'm just going to run to the workspace overview. I think that's created. Let's look at the configuration for this project. So here's our configuration. And this is fairly similar to what we've done before, so I'm only going to look at really the major differences and the major parts. So in the last example, we used our trust relationship project to create a single workspace. This time, we're going to use it to create a whole different project. So here's our project. And then we're going to set up a variable set to connect to it. And that variable set is just going to configure those dynamic credentials variables. We're using Vault provider auth and setting our Vault address and the run role and all of the other things that we need to tell Terraform Cloud to use Vault to provision dynamic credentials for AWS. A lot of pieces there, but again, it's Terraform Cloud connects to Vault, says, hey, I'm ready to create some trust relationship. Vault uses the AWS secrets engine to create that relationship and attaches it to the IAM role. So let's just look at that part. Here's the policy that lets us assume the role, and then the role itself is here. And again, keeping the policy is here. And again, we're keeping the policies fairly simple for this. Your security team is going to need to understand, okay, what exactly is the scope of the project? And in this case, I'm scoping it down to just S3, just to make sure that the only thing that we're provisioning here is S3 buckets and objects and things like that. So I believe that workspace is ready. We could configure some things here, but I'm just going to use the basic configuration. And again, we're not using the no-code module yet. We're creating a project that will use the no-code modules. And that's going to create everything we need for that. And it will, of course, just take a couple of minutes. So there's the plan. It's deciding what to create, all of our TFC variables, and our policy for AWS. And it's ready to apply. So I'll click apply and confirm. And again, that apply should just take a few moments. So while that's running, it will hopefully be successful. Let's go back and look at our no-code module. Here it is. I'm just calling it S3 website, maybe not the most creative. But with this module, we have a couple of inputs. We could configure the bucket name for this tutorial. I'm just going to let Terraform create a random bucket name, and we'll look at what the outputs are after we provision it. So going back here, I can provision a workspace. Again, we're not going to set any variables here, keeping it very simple. And I'm going to call this Project Phoenix public S3 website, something. Now, I do need to make sure that that is in the project S3 websites, because that's the one that has dynamic credentials configured. And then I'm going to go with the defaults for the rest of this and create the workspace. Again, this is with the role within our organization of somebody who's just publishing a website using a pre-baked module, using the dynamic credentials that are already set up for us. So this is somebody who's maybe not on the security team, might not be that familiar with Terraform or AWS credentials or security or any of that. We're just giving them a pre-baked set of configuration that they can provision. And it looks like the plan is already running. And we are ready to create our bucket. Almost ready anyway. And there's the apply running. We set that to happen automatically when we set up this workspace. We're creating a bucket with the ACLs and all of that. And again, as the end user, I don't have to worry about credentials or Terraform configuration. I just click a few buttons, or maybe we use the Terraform API for automation. Oops, managing our windows. And our bucket is probably ready to go. Might take a few moments to load. All right. And we've got a little bit of a Tetris game. My window isn't quite the right size for this for Zoom, but again, in just a few minutes with no code, no need for the end user to worry about AWS credentials, no need for the end user to maybe have to keep those AWS credentials secure. We can deploy a fixed set of configuration from Terraform Cloud with dynamic credentials. So I don't want to leave that bucket around, so I'll destroy that after the workshop. Let me manage Keynote. Apologies, I'm going to fumble a little bit getting back into Keynote. There we go. Oh, there we go. Recap. So what did we do in this workshop? We first looked at the simple case, but the main point of the workshop was to create a project to manage our trust relationships. And then we created a trust relationship between Terraform Cloud and Vault. After enabling the Vault Secrets engine, that let us define the scope and permissions for our dynamic credentials. And then we used those in a couple of different scenarios. We used it in the scenario of having one workspace that we can, our operators who are deploying infrastructure can write their Terraform configuration and manage it and deploy it, all without having to handle our secret keys. And then we looked at a second scenario where our security team set up a project using a no-code module that allows our end users to provision S3 buckets without writing Terraform configuration because they're using a no-code module, and without having to configure their AWS credentials because they're using dynamic credentials with that trust relationship. And then finally, I encourage you to try this yourself. We've got two different tutorials to start with. The first one here is about authenticating your cloud provider directly with dynamic credentials. That's the scenario we looked at way back in the beginning of the workshop, which was probably 20 minutes ago or something like that, where we set up a single trust relationship with AWS, and that's the basic use case. Again, if you're using Vault, you're almost certainly going to want to use Vault to manage your dynamic credentials. That's the second tutorial where you set up Vault and all of that. And from either of those, you can take the next step and look at the configuration to set up a project for your trust relationships, adding a little bit more complexity and power, and taking some automation to create your trust relationships rather than creating them manually. So that's been our workshop. Thank you very much, and please enjoy the rest of HashiDays.